Grace Bennett wore only a plain gray coat the morning she walked into the most prestigious school in the city to ask why her daughter's application had been rejected. Catherine Hayes looked her up and down and coldly explained that Westbridge needed families who fit the community the school had built. Grace did not argue. She simply placed the rejection letter on the table and asked one question that silenced the room. Had the board reviewed this decision? 2 hours later, 11 trustees quietly walked through the tall door. Then one by one, every trustee rose and bowed before Grace. If you want to know who Grace truly was, stay until the end, because Westbridge was about to pay dearly. The story began in a quiet neighborhood outside Boston, where Grace Bennett lived without drawing attention to herself. Her house was lovely but never showy, tucked behind a row of maple trees that turned gold every autumn. She had raised her daughter alone since her husband passed away several years earlier, building a life that valued calm over comfort and privacy over prestige. Neighbors knew her as polite, reserved, and endlessly composed, the kind of woman who remembered names but rarely shared her own story. Nobody on that street had any real sense of what Grace did for a living, and she preferred it that way. Her daughter, Ella, was 10 years old, sharp-minded, curious, and unusually patient for her age. Ella had worked hard to pass the entrance exam for Westbridge Academy, one of the most respected private schools in the state, known for its acclaimed science program and its long list of accomplished graduates. Her scores were strong, her letters of recommendation were glowing, and her interview had gone well by every account the family had heard. Grace never pushed her daughter toward prestige for its own sake, but Ella herself had been the one who wanted Westbridge, drawn by the promise of laboratories and mentors who could nurture her curiosity. For weeks, the family had quietly hoped, without ceremony, without expectation, simply waiting. Then, on an ordinary morning, the rejection letter arrived. The wording was strangely vague, stating only that Westbridge could not offer Ella a place for the coming year. There was no mention of academics, no explanation of any shortfall, nothing beyond a few polished, evasive sentences. Grace found this troubling, because an admissions officer had told her weeks earlier that Ella's file was among the strongest in her age group. She did not raise her voice or panic. She simply sat with the letter for a long moment, turning it over, feeling the absence of any real reason inside its careful language. Grace called the school directly, asking for clarity rather than reconsideration. The admissions staff hesitated, offering apologies without answers, until they finally agreed to arrange a meeting with Catherine Hayes, the chair of the admissions committee. Before Grace left her house that day, her personal assistant called to ask a simple question: did she want the Westbridge board notified that she was coming? Grace answered without hesitation that she did not, because she wanted to see for once how the school treated an ordinary parent walking through its doors. It was a small answer, but it hinted that Grace was not quite as ordinary as she seemed. Ella noticed her mother's quiet mood that morning but said little about it, sensing that the disappointment belonged to the grown-up world of letters and committees rather than anything she could fix herself. She had already begun imagining herself in Westbridge's science wing, picturing the telescopes and microscopes she had read about in the school brochure, and the rejection landed on her with a soft, private ache she tried not to show. Grace noticed this too, and it steadied her resolve more than any personal frustration could have. She was not the type of mother who demanded special treatment, and she had told Ella from the beginning that a single school did not decide a person's future. Still, something about the coldness of that letter refused to sit easily with her, a feeling less like wounded pride and more like recognition, as though she had seen this particular kind of dismissal before in another lifetime. She dressed simply that morning, choosing a plain coat over anything that might suggest wealth or influence, wanting to walk into Westbridge as nothing more than a concerned parent asking a fair question. Grace arrived at Westbridge alone, driving an unremarkable car and carrying nothing but the rejection letter in a plain folder. She wore a tailored but understated outfit, the kind that suggested competence rather than wealth, and she walked through the administrative wing without an assistant, without an escort, without any sign that she expected special attention. The hallways were lined with portraits of donors, prominent alumni, and distinguished families whose names appeared on plaques above doorways and libraries. Grace studied these images for a moment, noting how carefully the school had built a narrative of legacy and belonging, long before Catherine Hayes appeared to greet her with a practiced, polite smile. At first, Catherine maintained a professional tone, explaining that Westbridge received an overwhelming number of applications each year, and that many excellent students were turned away simply because there were not enough seats available. Grace listened patiently before asking a direct question, wanting to know exactly which factor caused a strong application, one with solid scores and a successful interview, to be denied. Catherine hesitated, offering vague generalities about fit and readiness, phrases that meant very little once repeated back to her. Grace pressed further, asking precise, specific questions that slowly stripped away the comfortable ambiguity Catherine had been relying on, until the woman's composure began to crack at the edges. Eventually, Catherine admitted that Westbridge evaluated more than academic merit alone. The school also considered a family's ability to participate in the community, its social traditions, its history of financial contribution, and what she called its overall fit with Westbridge culture. Grace asked plainly whether this meant the school was weighing a parent's income, and Catherine bristled, accusing her of oversimplifying a complex and nuanced process. Yet only a moment later, glancing down at Grace's file, Catherine let slip a line she likely regretted the moment it left her mouth, saying that Westbridge needed families capable of sustaining the environment the school had spent over a century building. Grace understood immediately what that sentence meant. Ella had not been rejected for lack of ability. She had been rejected because Grace, in Catherine's eyes, was simply a single mother without the social standing Westbridge valued. Grace did not argue or raise her voice, and she did not defend her circumstances or explain her late husband or her career. She only asked one calm, pointed question, wanting to know whether the Board of Trustees had approved this particular standard of evaluation. Catherine answered with obvious confidence that the board trusted the admissions committee completely, and Grace offered the faintest, most composed smile before replying that she would very much like to hear that trust confirmed in person. Catherine's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her otherwise polished demeanor, as though she sensed the ground beneath the conversation had quietly changed shape. She had handled dozens of disappointed parents before, some pleading, some furious, and she had a rehearsed set of responses for nearly every reaction. Grace's calm was different, unsettling in a way Catherine could not immediately name, because it carried no desperation and no attempt to bargain for her daughter's admission. It felt less like a mother fighting for a place and more like someone quietly gathering evidence, and that distinction, though Catherine could not yet articulate it, would prove to matter a great deal before the day was over. Catherine refused Grace's request to meet with the board, insisting that Grace was overreacting to an ordinary admissions decision that families faced every year. Before the conversation could go further, Principal Jackson Carter walked in, having heard from a nervous staff member that a parent was applying pressure in the administrative office. Jackson moved quickly, hoping to resolve the matter before it escalated into something he would need to explain to anyone above him. He told Grace, in a tone meant to sound final, that admissions decisions at Westbridge were not subject to review or reconsideration once they had been issued. Grace asked him directly whether he had personally reviewed Ella's application before it was denied. Jackson admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that he had not, since admissions decisions typically stayed within Catherine's committee and rarely reached his desk unless there was a dispute worth escalating. Grace followed with another question, asking whether he was defending a decision he had never actually examined for himself. The question landed harder than Jackson expected, and his easy confidence began to waver as he searched for a response that would not sound as weak as it felt in that moment. He tried a different approach, suggesting that hundreds of wealthy, well-connected families accepted rejection every year without turning it into what he called a crisis. Grace replied evenly that this was never a question about one child being turned away, but about the reasoning quietly hiding behind that decision. Jackson, visibly irritated now, instructed a staff member to bring the meeting to a close, treating Grace as though she were simply another parent who needed to be managed and ushered out. Grace did not move toward the door. Instead, she reached for her phone and placed a call, speaking only a few words once the line connected. She said she was at Westbridge and believed an urgent meeting was needed. Jackson caught the name she used, Elizabeth, but it did not register with him immediately, since the name alone meant nothing out of the ordinary in that moment. 3 minutes later, his own phone rang, and the caller was Elizabeth Morgan, chair of the Westbridge Board of Trustees. Jackson's face went pale as he listened, and Elizabeth gave him a single instruction before ending the call, telling him plainly that Mrs. Bennet was not to leave the building under any circumstances. He lowered the phone slowly, aware that every staff member in the room was watching him, waiting for an explanation he did not yet have. Catherine leaned forward and asked what was happening, but Jackson only shook his head and told her to wait. He glanced at Grace, who had settled into her chair with the same unhurried patience she had carried since she first walked through the front doors, and for the first time that morning, he found himself genuinely unsure of who exactly he was speaking with. The certainty that had carried him through countless difficult parent meetings had quietly drained out of him, replaced by a growing unease that told him this particular morning would not end the way he had planned. Grace was escorted upstairs to the board's meeting room, and the entire tone of the building seemed to shift around her. Jackson's demeanor changed completely, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by careful, almost anxious politeness, while Catherine began to sense that something far larger than a single admissions dispute was unfolding. While the trustees were being gathered, Logan Reed, the school's chief financial officer, entered the room and stopped mid-step the moment he saw Grace seated near the window. He addressed her immediately, saying her name with a level of respect that surprised everyone else present. Catherine asked, with visible confusion, whether Logan actually knew this woman personally. Logan offered only a brief, careful reply, suggesting that Catherine might want to wait for the board before asking further questions. The tension in the room thickened noticeably, and Grace remained composed throughout, betraying none of the satisfaction she might reasonably have felt at the shift taking place around her. She asked Logan to bring the school's admissions figures from the past 3 years, specifying exactly what she wanted reviewed. She requested the acceptance rate for children from single-parent households, the distribution of accepted families across different income levels, the pattern of financial contributions made by families both before and after their children were admitted, and any cases in which a rejected application had later been reversed following a pledge of donation. Jackson objected sharply, insisting that Grace had no standing to request internal financial and admissions data from the school. Logan looked at him steadily before responding. He said quite simply that she did. It was a small sentence, but it landed like the second major turn of the morning, confirming that Grace's presence in that room was not incidental, and that her authority within Westbridge's affairs extended further than either Jackson or Catherine had understood. Catherine's earlier confidence had entirely evaporated by this point, replaced by a rising unmistakable sense of alarm as she began to reconsider everything she had said to Grace only an hour before, searching her memory for exactly how carelessly she might have spoken. Outside the meeting room, staff members whispered among themselves, sensing that something unusual was taking place behind the closed doors, though none of them understood the full shape of it yet. Jackson paced near the window, rehearsing explanations he suspected would not hold up once the trustees arrived, while Catherine sat rigidly at the table, replaying every word of her earlier conversation with Grace. Logan busied himself gathering the requested figures, moving with the brisk efficiency of a man who understood exactly what was coming and wanted no part of being unprepared for it. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment the full board would walk through the door and the true weight of the morning would finally become clear to everyone in it. One by one, the members of the Westbridge Board of Trustees arrived. Attorneys, business leaders, alumni, philanthropists, and senior academic figures filed into the room and took their seats around the long table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet concern. Finally, Elizabeth Morgan entered, and the room settled instantly, the way a room settles when everyone present understands who truly holds authority within it. Grace remained seated, calm and unmoving, while Jackson stepped forward, clearly hoping to offer his own version of events before anyone else could speak first. Elizabeth raised her hand and stopped him before he could begin. She turned to Grace and in a clear, steady voice, she said that on behalf of the entire board, she owed her an apology. Then Elizabeth rose from her chair, Ryan Walker rose beside her a moment later, and one after another, every remaining trustee followed, until the whole board stood facing Grace in complete silence. Slowly, deliberately, the entire board bowed their heads toward her. Jackson and Catherine froze, utterly unable to process what they were witnessing. This was not the kind of respectful gesture offered to a disappointed parent whose child had been turned away. It was something else entirely. A display reserved for someone who held a very particular kind of standing within Westbridge's history. Elizabeth explained it plainly to the room. Grace Bennett, she said, was the chair of the Bennett Education Foundation, an organization that few people at Westbridge had ever connected to the quiet, unassuming woman seated among them. 12 years earlier, Grace's foundation had rescued Westbridge from a severe financial crisis that had nearly forced the school to close its doors permanently. Grace had deliberately kept her name away from every building, every scholarship program, and every public record connected to that rescue, preferring the school's recovery to remain the story rather than her own involvement in it. More significantly, the Bennett Foundation now oversaw an education trust worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and Westbridge remained one of its long-term beneficiaries, dependent on that continued support in ways very few people inside the building fully understood. Grace did not own the school, and she held no power to unilaterally overturn its decisions, a detail that kept the story grounded and believable rather than turning her into some all-powerful outsider. But under the terms of the original funding agreement, she retained a standing, honorary position on matters of oversight, along with the authority to request an audit whenever admissions policy showed signs of economic discrimination. Jackson had never actually met her before that day, since Grace always sent representatives in her place. Catherine, for her part, had known absolutely nothing about any of it. Grace finally spoke, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm, saying that she had not come to Westbridge that day as a donor. She had come as a mother. The silence that followed her words stretched long enough that several trustees exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to speak or simply let the weight of the moment settle on its own. Ryan Walker was the first to break it, asking gently whether Grace intended to pursue any formal action against the school regarding what had happened to her daughter's application. Grace shook her head, explaining that punishment was not the reason she had asked for this meeting, and that she had no interest in using her position to force an outcome for one child when the deeper problem clearly reached far wider than a single rejected file. Elizabeth studied her for a long moment, recognizing in that answer the same quiet restraint that had made Grace's foundation so effective and so trusted over the years, precisely because she never used her influence carelessly and never for herself. Grace made no request for Ella to be admitted, and the board found this genuinely surprising given everything that had just been revealed. Instead, she asked for a full investigation into the entire admissions process, a request that carried far greater consequences than reversing a single decision ever could. Logan presented preliminary figures he had gathered earlier, and a troubling pattern quickly became visible to everyone at the table. Over the previous 3 years, numerous applicants with exceptionally strong academic records had been quietly classified as poor cultural fit, a label that appeared repeatedly without any clear or consistent explanation attached to it. This pattern concentrated heavily among certain groups of families. Children from single-parent households appeared disproportionately in the rejected category, alongside families whose parents worked ordinary, unremarkable jobs, families with no history of charitable donation to the school, and students whose parents lacked connections to Westbridge's familiar social circles. In contrast, several applicants with noticeably lower academic scores had been accepted shortly after their families pledged significant financial contributions to the school. The correlation was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, and everyone in the room understood exactly what it implied. Ryan Walker began questioning Catherine directly, his tone sharpening with each answer she gave. Catherine defended herself by pointing out that Westbridge was a private institution that depended on financial contributions simply to continue operating. Grace agreed that funding mattered, acknowledging this reality without hesitation, but she drew a clear and important distinction that silenced further argument. Raising money for a school was one thing, she said. Measuring a child's worth by the size of a parent's bank account was something else entirely, and the two should never have been allowed to blur together the way they clearly had. Under continued pressure, Catherine was forced to admit that her committee had been using an informal scoring system that never appeared in any official Westbridge documentation. Jackson, it turned out, had known this system existed for some time. He had chosen to look the other way because donations had steadily increased under its use, and he had convinced himself that the arrangement, however uncomfortable, was simply the price of keeping the school financially stable. What had begun as a single mother's personal grievance had transformed, within the span of one long morning, into something far more serious, a structural failure that reached into the very foundation of how Westbridge decided who belonged within its walls. Elizabeth asked Logan how far back the pattern extended, and he admitted that he had only examined 3 years of records so far, meaning the true scope of the problem could well be larger. Several trustees exchanged troubled glances, clearly grappling with the realization that a school they had trusted, and in many cases personally funded, had been quietly sorting children by their family's wealth rather than their abilities. Grace watched the room absorb this without interrupting, letting the weight of the evidence speak for itself rather than pressing her own point further. She had learned long ago that the most effective way to expose a broken system was rarely through confrontation, but through simply placing the truth in front of people who could no longer pretend not to see it. Catherine refused to accept full responsibility for what the data had revealed. Instead, she turned the conversation back toward Grace, suggesting that Grace was using her financial influence to pressure the school into changing an admissions decision that directly benefited her own daughter. It was a sharp, calculated move, and for a brief moment it worked. If word of this meeting spread beyond these walls, Catherine argued, Grace could easily be portrayed as a wealthy parent who had bought her child's way into a coveted seat, regardless of how the situation actually looked from the inside of the room. A few trustees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, visibly weighing the risk Catherine had just described. Grace, however, did not flinch or attempt to defend herself against the accusation. Instead, she asked that a specific statement be entered formally into the meeting's official record. Ella Bennett, she said clearly, would not be reconsidered for admission during the current enrollment cycle, regardless of anything uncovered in the investigation that followed. The room fell into stunned silence at the request. Grace explained that she wanted no special privilege extended to her own daughter under any circumstances. What she wanted instead was a thorough examination of every other application that had been affected by the same broken standard. This single statement immediately dismantled Catherine's entire argument, removing any credible suggestion that Grace's motives were personal or self-serving rather than genuinely aimed at correcting the system itself. Ryan Walker, watching this unfold, made his position clear without hesitation. He proposed forming an independent investigative committee to review every questionable admissions decision from the past several years, separate from anyone currently connected to the existing administration. Elizabeth agreed immediately, recognizing that only genuine independence would give the investigation any real credibility going forward. Jackson sat quietly through this exchange, the full weight of his position finally beginning to register with him, as he understood, perhaps for the first time that morning, that his job as principal of Westbridge was now seriously in jeopardy. Catherine tried once more to steer the conversation, suggesting that any investigation would take considerable time and disrupt the school's operations right before the new academic term began. Elizabeth cut her off gently but firmly, noting that a school which had spent years quietly measuring children by their parents' wealth had no standing left to argue about inconvenient timing. The other trustees nodded in agreement, and for the first time since the meeting began, Catherine seemed to grasp that her earlier confidence had done nothing but dig the hole beneath her feet a little deeper. Grace watched this shift without satisfaction, feeling no triumph in Catherine's discomfort, only a steady resolve that the process now underway would need to be handled carefully and thoroughly if it was going to matter at all. While the trustees debated next steps, Logan discovered a chain of internal messages during his rapid review of the school's records. One message, sent by Catherine to Jackson roughly 6 months earlier, stated plainly that Westbridge could not keep wasting spots on families unlikely to grow alongside the school. Another exchange referenced prioritizing applications with what Catherine had called strong potential for long-term relationship value, language that made the underlying calculation impossible to misread once it was laid out in front of the board. Worse still, Jackson had once explicitly warned Catherine in writing never to let those particular criteria appear anywhere in official Westbridge documentation. This single message proved conclusively that Jackson had known the policy was deeply improper long before that morning's confrontation ever began, and that his earlier claims of ignorance had been a calculated deflection rather than an honest gap in his knowledge. Grace read the messages Logan handed her without any visible reaction. Her expression giving away nothing of what she felt as the full extent of the deception became clear to everyone present. She did not gloat or allow herself even a moment of quiet satisfaction. Instead, she asked a single question that settled over the room like a heavy silence. How many families, she wondered aloud, had spent months believing their child simply was not good enough, when the truth had never actually had anything to do with their child's ability at all? Nobody offered an answer, because none of them had one worth giving, and the question lingered in the air long after Grace had finished speaking, becoming the moral center of everything that had happened that morning. Elizabeth moved quickly once the silence broke. She asked Catherine to step down temporarily from her position as chair of the admissions committee while the investigation proceeded. Jackson was suspended from any oversight of admissions matters pending the outcome of the same review. Ryan was formally assigned to lead the newly formed reform committee, tasked with rebuilding the school's admissions process from the ground up, using transparent standards that could withstand exactly this kind of scrutiny in the future. Jackson attempted a final defense, arguing that he had inherited many of these practices from earlier administrations and had never personally invented the flawed scoring system Catherine had used. Elizabeth listened patiently before reminding him, in a tone that left no room for further argument, that inheriting a broken system did not excuse choosing to protect it once its costs to real children became undeniable. Catherine said little in response, staring at the printed messages in front of her as though seeing her own words for the first time through someone else's eyes. The meeting, which had begun as a routine complaint from a single parent, had by now completely reshaped the balance of power inside the room, and everyone present understood that Westbridge would not return to how it had operated the day before. Several trustees quietly worried that Grace might withdraw her foundation's support entirely in response to what had been uncovered. If that happened, Westbridge would face severe financial strain almost immediately, given how deeply the school's operations had come to depend on that ongoing funding relationship. Grace, however, made no move toward that outcome. She explained calmly that punishing the school as a whole would ultimately punish teachers, staff, and countless students who had nothing at all to do with the failures of a handful of administrators. Instead, the Bennett Education Foundation proposed an entirely new framework for continued support going forward. Future funding would depend on the school maintaining a transparent, clearly documented admissions process, subject to regular and independent auditing. It would also require scholarships awarded strictly on merit and genuine need, with clear criteria that any family could review and understand. Admissions staff would be barred from knowing how much money a given family had donated at any point during the evaluation period itself, removing the temptation entirely from the equation. A formal appeals process would also be established, giving parents somewhere to turn if they believed a decision had been handled unfairly. The board voted on these terms almost immediately. The result was close to unanimous, with only the faintest handful of hesitations among trustees still adjusting to how quickly the morning had unfolded. Grace did not become the school's new administrator, and she made no attempt to turn Westbridge into an extension of her own personal authority. She simply used the influence she already held to force a broken system to correct itself, choosing repair over retaliation even when retaliation would have been entirely within her power. This choice mattered a great deal to how the rest of the story would be remembered. It gave Grace real, undeniable power in the eyes of everyone at that table, while never once making her difficult to trust or root for. She left the meeting that afternoon the same way she had arrived, quietly, without fanfare, carrying nothing but the same plain folder she had brought with her that morning. Ryan walked her to the entrance, still visibly shaken by everything the day had revealed, and admitted that he had never once suspected the woman sitting quietly across from him that morning held the kind of influence that could reshape an entire institution within a single afternoon. Grace told him gently that influence mattered far less than what a person chose to do with it once it was in their hands, a sentiment that stayed with Ryan long after she had driven away. Behind her, the board remained seated for a long while, absorbing the shape of the new arrangement they had just approved, aware that the true test would not be the vote itself, but everything Westbridge did in the months that followed. A year passed, and Westbridge had changed in ways that were impossible to miss for anyone who had known the school before. Catherine left the institution entirely once the independent investigation reached its conclusion, her departure handled quietly but decisively. Jackson resigned not long after, once the board formally determined that he had failed in his basic duty to oversee the admissions process he had long claimed sole authority over. Ryan Walker took on a new role as chair of a freshly created Ethics and Governance Committee, a position built specifically in response to everything the investigation had uncovered. Logan continued managing the school's finances, though his responsibilities had grown to include publishing a detailed scholarship report every year, openly documenting where funding went and who it reached. Grace remained at a careful distance from the school's daily affairs, exactly as she had promised the board she would. When trustees proposed naming the school's new library after her in recognition of everything she had done to reform Westbridge, Grace declined without hesitation, asking instead that the building be named something else entirely. She suggested calling it the Open Door Learning Center, a name that reflected the values she wanted the school to embody going forward rather than any individual's personal legacy. The board agreed, and the building opened under that name within a matter of months. Ella appeared only briefly in this part of the story, exactly 1 year after her original rejection, when she quietly decided on her own to submit a new application to Westbridge. Grace made no calls on her daughter's behalf. She said nothing to the board and made no mention of her own name or history with the school throughout the process. Under the new policy Westbridge had adopted, every application was now evaluated using a blind identification system that concealed a family's identity from the reviewers entirely. Ella was accepted. Grace read the acceptance letter quietly at her kitchen table, saying very little as she folded it and set it aside, allowing herself only a small private smile. Ella noticed the smile but did not press for details, sensing that whatever thoughts passed behind her mother's eyes in that moment belonged to a story she was not yet ready to hear in full. She would learn pieces of it eventually, the way most children eventually learn the quiet sacrifices their parents made on their behalf. But for now she simply hugged her mother and asked when the new science wing would be finished. Grace laughed softly and told her it already had been, and that she would see it for herself soon enough. Outside their window, the maple trees had turned gold again, marking a full year since the letter that started everything, though neither of them dwelled on that particular anniversary out loud. On the day the Open Door Learning Center officially opened, Grace returned to Westbridge one final time. There was no lavish ceremony arranged in her honor, no plaque bearing her name above the entrance, and no announcement singling her out from the crowd of parents, teachers, and students gathered for the occasion. Elizabeth Morgan stood beside Ryan and Logan as Grace walked quietly through the hallway toward the new building, her presence noted only by those who already understood exactly what she had done for the school. Ryan thought back to the first day the board had risen to their feet and bowed before her, a memory that still carried weight even a full year later. He told her, as they walked, that the board had bowed that day because of everything she had already done for Westbridge long before anyone in that room understood who she truly was. Grace considered this for a moment before answering, her voice calm but carrying a quiet weight of its own. She said she hoped that in the future, no one at Westbridge would need to bow before anybody at all, simply to remember what doing the right thing looked like. The words settled over the small group as they reached the doors of the new center, and nobody rushed to respond, sensing that Grace had just distilled the entire year into a single, simple thought. She had not won because she possessed more wealth than Catherine, or because her name carried more weight within certain circles than Jackson's once had. She had won because, when given every opportunity to seek retribution against people who had wronged her family, she chose instead to repair the system that had made such wrongs possible in the first place. Westbridge, too, absorbed a difficult lesson from everything that had unfolded. A school could possess the most beautiful buildings, the highest tuition, and the most distinguished families walking through its halls, yet still fail to understand the true purpose of education if it measured a child's worth by the size of a parent's bank account, rather than by the child's own ability and character. Elizabeth said as much during her brief remarks at the opening, careful not to name any of the people responsible for the failures that had led them there, choosing instead to focus on the path forward the school had committed to. In the final moment of that afternoon, Grace stepped outside the building alone, pausing briefly beneath the entrance before walking toward her car. Behind her, engraved simply above the doors of the new center, were 4 words that captured everything the past year had been about. Talent deserves a door. She did not look back as she left, and the story, much like Grace herself, closed quietly, without spectacle having already said everything that truly needed to be said. Ella waited by the car, already halfway through a book about the science wing's new telescopes, entirely unaware of how many lives had been quietly reshaped so that she could walk through those doors like any other student. Grace watched her for a moment before starting the engine, thinking not of boardrooms or trustees or the weight of the past year, but simply of an ordinary afternoon and an ordinary drive home. That, in the end, was the outcome she had wanted all along, not recognition, not power, not even gratitude, but the simple, unremarkable normalcy of a child getting the chance she had always deserved, judged for nothing more and nothing less than who she actually was.